systems and to safeguard the right to vote next November. That work is critical because at base, trust in our democracy is what keeps our country vibrant and strong. Faith in our democratic institutions binds diverse people with different values and different backgrounds together in common cause. In the wake of the insurrection, nothing could be more important in your work or mine than rebuilding that trust. Thank you again for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, thank you for being here. Over the past several years, Americans have seen their liberties attacked. Every right we enjoy under the First Amendment has been assaulted. Every single one. Your right to worship, your right to assemble, your right to petition, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, every single one. There are places today where Americans have seen their liberties attacked. Every right we enjoy under the First Amendment has been assaulted. Every single one. Your right to worship, your right to assemble, your right to petition, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, every single one. There are places today where a full congregation can still not meet on a Sunday morning. Your right to assemble? 4 weeks ago, I spoke to the New Mexico Republican Party in Amarillo, Texas. They had to go to Texas for freedom because they weren't allowed to assemble in their own state. Your right to petition your government? We sat here today on Capitol Hill having an important hearing with the director of the FBI, but our constituents can't come to their Capitol, lobby their member of Congress to redress their grievances because the Speaker of the House won't let them in. Freedom of the press? Maybe the best example is the President won't go to the border, the Vice President won't go to the border. When Secretary Mayorkas went to the border, he wouldn't let the press in the very facilities he was touring. And of course, freedom of speech, we all know what's happened to that. Big tech, censoring conservatives, the cancel culture mob attacking anyone who disagrees with them, deplatforming the sitting President of the United States, Democrats writing letters to the network carriers telling them to take certain news organizations off their network, not off their platform. Freedom is under attack, and Director, a lot of Americans think you're part of the problem. Before you got there, the Comey FBI spied on the Trump campaign. Over the last 3 years, the FBI labeled the baseball field shooting where our friend and colleague Steve Scalise was shot, labeled that suicide by cop for 3 years. We know the guy set out to go after Republicans. He had a piece of paper in his pocket with 6 Republican names on it. But somehow the FBI thought it was suicide by cop. Thank goodness you've changed that. More recently, the FBI raided the New York apartment of Mayor Giuliani. The president's personal lawyer, former U.S. attorney, ran the Southern District of New York office. According to press accounts, he said he was willing to give whatever information you all wanted, whatever the Justice Department wanted, but no, you kicked in his door instead. How about the couple in Alaska, Paul and Marilyn Huper? They sure witnessed an attack on their liberty in an up-close and personal way. The FBI kicked in their door, handcuffed them, held them at gunpoint, interrogated them for 4 hours in their own home. There was just one problem. They had the wrong people. Had the wrong people. Took their phones, took their laptop, took a pocket-sized copy of the Constitution. There's got to be some irony in that. And then there's FISA. 2018, FISA court Judge Boasberg said there were major privacy violations by the FBI. 2019, Inspector General Horowitz did two investigations. First one was on the Carter Page FISA application. He found 17 errors in that, 51 wrong or unsupported statements in that FISA application. 17 errors, 51 wrong statements. That's a nice way of saying 68 lies that were taken to the FISA court. Mr. Horowitz then looked at 25 randomly sampled FISA applications, specifically the Woods file, the underlying documents that supports what's taken to the court. In every single one, he said there was a problem. All 25. In 4 of them, he couldn't even find the Woods file. But the last time the director was in front of us, February of last year, you told us everything was fine. You said this, quote, Americans should not lose sleep over the FISA application process. But just 2 months ago, Judge Boasberg was back with another report, and he said there are, quote, apparent widespread violations by the FBI of the standards they have in place to deal with Section 702 of FISA. Which raises a sort of fundamental question. Why are you using the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to spy on Americans, Director? I appreciate the tough job you have and the good work that the vast majority of your agents, I think, do. But freedom-loving Americans have concerns about their liberty, but I think they also have concerns about the opportunity cost. When you're kicking in the door of the president's lawyer, when you're interrogating an innocent couple for 4 hours, when you're spying on Americans, then by definition, that means there are fewer resources going to stop terrorists at our southern border, stopping cyber attacks, prosecuting Antifa, terrorists, and other rioters who attacked law enforcement, small businesses, the Capitol, and did over $1 billion of damage over the last year. And frankly, that there also means there's fewer resources to figure out where this virus started. So we're going to have some tough questions for you, Director. We appreciate you being here, and we trust that you're going to answer our questions. You're going to answer them directly. Because again, when you think about what Americans have had to live through, the rights that they have that have been infringed as citizens of this great country, it's a serious time. And so we hope you'll answer the tough questions that will come from the Republican side. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I will now introduce today's witness. Christopher Wray became the 8th Director of the FBI on August 2, 2017. Director Wray began his law enforcement career in 1997, serving in the Department of Justice as an Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. In 2001, he was named Associate Deputy Attorney General and then Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Office of the Deputy Attorney General in Washington, D.C. Mr. Wray was nominated by President George Bush in 2003 to be the Assistant Attorney General for DOJ's Criminal Division, which included the Counterterrorism Section and the Counterintelligence and Export Control Section at the time. In addition to his extensive time in public service, Mr. Wray has spent a total of almost 17 years practicing law in the international law firm of King & Spalding, LLP, working in the area of government investigations and white-collar crime. At the time of his nomination to be FBI Director, Mr. Wray was chair of the firm's Special Matters and Government Investigations Practice Group. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Yale University in 1989 and earned his law degree from Yale Law School in 1992. He also clerked for Judge J. Michael Ludwig of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. We welcome Director Wray. We thank him for participating today. Now, if you'd please rise, I'll begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and beliefs, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please note that your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Director Wray, you may begin.
Good morning, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member Jordan, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the FBI's enduring efforts to keep the American people safe. As you know, over our almost 113-year history, the FBI has worked tirelessly alongside our trusted partners to confront a host of threats facing our country, from the persistent threat posed by terrorists, both foreign and domestic, to the counterintelligence threat posed by the governments of aggressive adversaries like China and Russia, to the scourge of violence threatening our neighborhoods, to the rising and evolving threat posed by cyber criminals who seek to hold hostage our companies and our critical infrastructure. I suspect we'll be covering these and other topics today, but I'd like to start by discussing an issue that is of utmost concern to me, to you, and to all Americans, which is the prevalence of violence in our country. Over the last few years, we've witnessed the troubling phenomenon of people resorting to violence and destruction of property to further their ideological, political, or social goals. Far too often, we're seeing individuals inspired by one or more extremist ideologies to commit criminal acts against their fellow Americans. Now, The FBI does not and should not police ideology, and we do not investigate groups or individuals based on the exercise of First Amendment protected activity alone. But when we encounter violence and threats to public safety, the FBI will not hesitate to take appropriate action. That is not a controversial issue that should force anyone to take sides. We can all agree that violence in any form in support of any set of beliefs cannot and will not be tolerated, because violence undermines one of the most basic freedoms of all Americans, the right to feel safe and secure in our own homes and communities. We saw this kind of extremist violence on January 6th, when an angry mob used violence and the destruction of property to break into the U.S. Capitol in a failed attempt to undermine our institutions of government and our democratic process. An assault where you, the members of Congress, were victims, but where all Americans were victimized, and more than 100 law enforcement officers were injured in just a few hours. Through the dogged work of FBI agents, analysts, and professionals working alongside federal, state, and local partners, we've been able to make close to 500 arrests so far, with more sure to come. We also saw extremist violence during last summer's civil unrest. And although most citizens made their voices heard through peaceful, lawful protests, others, far too many, persistently exploited those protests to pursue violent extremist agendas. In Portland alone, hundreds of law enforcement officers sustained injuries, and damage to federal buildings was estimated in the millions of dollars. Across the country, federal, state, and local authorities arrested thousands of individuals who committed criminal acts surrounding those protests. And nearly every one of the FBI's 56 field offices opened investigations, amounting to hundreds of investigations involving violent and destructive conduct. More recently, we've seen an alarming increase in hate crimes across the country, many targeting members of the Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Jewish communities. In some cases, these crimes are carried out by individuals we characterize as racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. To confront this threat, we've taken a multi-pronged approach, focusing on our traditional investigative efforts through our civil rights program and our domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell that we created about a year and a half ago, but also enhancing our law enforcement training, public outreach, and support to our state and local partners. Our efforts to stem extremist violence are on top of our continued and extensive work to disrupt violent gangs, drug organizations, and human traffickers whose criminal acts devastate families and communities. For many of you, violent crime remains the most significant and most pernicious threat you face in your home district. And in difficult times like these, we must never forget the extraordinary bravery of our federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement members who risk life and safety every single day to protect the public and keep the peace. And I say that because over the past year, we've seen a troubling uptick in violence against members of the law enforcement community. In just the first 5 months of 2021, 36 officers have been feloniously killed on the job. That's far surpassing the number by this time last year. To put that in perspective, that's almost 2 law enforcement officers shot and killed every week. And that's not counting all those officers who've died in the line of duty facing the countless other inherent dangers of the job, like racing in pursuit of a suspect and dying in a car accident, or drowning in an attempted rescue, or even the scores of officers who've died from COVID-19 because law enforcement, of course, kept coming to work every day, right through the teeth of the pandemic. Nor is it counting all those officers who've been badly injured, but thankfully survived, but whose lives and whose families' lives have been forever changed. Now, the loss of any agent or officer is heartbreaking for their families, for their departments, for their communities that they serve. We in the FBI know that all too well, with the terrible, terrible loss of Special Agents Laura Schwarzenberger and Dan Alfin this past February, shot and killed down near Miami. Each one of the officers and agents we've lost this year were people who got up one morning, picked up their badge, not knowing whether they'd make it home that night. And they did their jobs despite all the hardships they've faced in this almost epically difficult year, because they were devoted to protecting their fellow Americans, both friends and strangers alike. And we owe these dedicated public servants a debt of gratitude. More than that, we owe them our best efforts to help stem the tide of violence. All of us here today have a shared responsibility to take a stand, to protect our communities, to support those who serve in law enforcement, and to condemn violence regardless of its motivation. And we in the FBI are ready to do that exactly, to use all the tools at our disposal to uphold the rule of law and to fulfill our mission to protect every American, because there is simply no place in this country for hatred, intolerance, or violence, regardless of its motivation, ideology, or otherwise. So thank you for taking the time to hear from me today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. According to documents we've received from the Bureau, the FBI was aware that several violent extremists already under investigation were preparing to travel to Washington in January. In December, FBI Atlanta issued an alert that certain militia groups were preparing for a significant event in January, perhaps on Inauguration Day. And on January 5th, a report from FBI Norfolk warned about specific calls for violence at the Capitol the next day, some of them graphic. Congress needs to hear of glass breaking, doors being kicked in, and blood being spilled. The report also noted that individuals were sharing maps of the tunnels underneath the Capitol complex and listed rally points where the attackers would gather before advancing on the building. We know that the Norfolk report made it to the FBI's Washington field office in advance of the attack. And yet, for days after the attack, the head of that field office insisted that it had received no intelligence suggesting anything other than First Amendment activity. Director Wray, the warnings coming in from around the country were clear. Here in Washington, did the FBI simply miss the evidence, or did it see the evidence and fail to piece it together?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you could imagine, we are just as outraged by what happened on January 6th and just as determined to do our part to make sure that never happens again. Now, the Norfolk report that you referenced was a specific piece of raw, unverified intelligence that emerged on January 5th, the day before, from a source online, unvetted, and despite the raw nature of it, it was quickly passed, not one, not two, but 3 different ways to the Capitol Police. One, an email to their representatives on our Joint Terrorism Task Force. 2, in a verbal briefing in our command post that included members of the Capitol Police, MPD, et cetera. And 3rd, in our law enforcement portal, which all law enforcement partners have access to. So we tried to make sure that we got that information to the right people. Obviously, anytime there is an attack, especially one as significant as this one, you can be darn sure that we are going to be looking hard at how we can do better, how we can do more, how we can do things differently in terms of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating intelligence. Now, you also mentioned individuals under investigation before January 6th. So a couple things on that. First, the FBI did disseminate, I think, about a dozen intelligence products, including warning of domestic violent extremism related to the election, some talking about it continuing past the election all the way through inauguration, including reports together with DHS put out in December the month before. As far as individuals actually under investigation, now that we're close to 500 arrests into the matter, you may be surprised to learn that, in fact, almost none of the individuals charged and found to be involved with the attack on the Capitol were in fact individuals who were previously present under investigation.
At 12:53 p.m. on January 6th, rioters broke through the outer barricades surrounding the lawn of the Capitol. Shortly after 1:45, the rioters surged past the Capitol Police protecting the Capitol's west steps, and at 1:49, officers officially declared there was a riot at the Capitol. Acting Attorney General Rosen testified before the Oversight Committee that he learned that the FBI and the ATF received requests for assistance from the Capitol Police and were beginning to respond. When specifically in that timeline of events did Capitol Police request assistance from the FBI, and how quickly was that help deployed?
I don't have the specific time for you, so I don't want to misspeak.
Okay. The FBI's Washington field office is one of the largest field offices in the country. The field office was reportedly found by an internal review in 2019 to be both ineffective and inefficient. Specifically, the review criticized the field office's mechanisms for collecting and analyzing threat intelligence, as well as its procedures for sharing intelligence with other law enforcement agencies, including the Capitol Police. Did the Washington field office's domestic terrorism shortcomings lead to a delayed response in the lead up to and on January 6th?
My recollection of that particular audit or inspection is that it was a while back and that we had recently changed the leadership of the Washington field office and made a number of reforms. So to my knowledge, at least, none of the issues that were discussed in that earlier report contributed to the response on January 6th.
Thank you. My time is short, but I want to get in one last question. In February, the Secretary of Defense converted senior military officials and civilian leadership of the armed forces to assess the problem of extremist ideology in the military's ranks. In late April, the Department of Homeland Security announced it was conducting an internal review to root out white supremacy and other extremist ideology in its ranks. There can be no question that law enforcement agencies across the country face a similar challenge. Is the FBI conducting its own internal inspection or review to root out white supremacy and other extremist ideology? And if not, will you commit to conducting such a review?
Well, Mr. Chairman, obviously we take the prospect of what the intelligence community or law enforcement would refer to as an insider threat very seriously. We have a whole slew of procedures and internal reviews that speak to that, and I'd be happy to see if we can provide you more information on that separately.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. McClintock will go first for our side.
Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, last month, 180,000 foreign nationals illegally crossed our border. That's a 674% increase over last May, nearly 1 million so far this year. The leaders of Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries all say this is in direct response to the Biden open border policies. I don't think there's any question that's the case. These policies have produced the largest human trafficking operation since the international slave trade. Can you tell us how many persons on the terrorist watch list have been encountered this year crossing through our southern border?
Congressman, I'm not sure that I have that number, but it may be that we can provide the specifics separately. I do know that our field offices down on the border work very closely with CBP, especially focused on so-called special interest aliens as well as potential.
But I've watched
I just don't have the
family
numbers
groups
sitting
being
here.
flagged through straight to transportation hubs. How many persons with criminal records or criminal warrants have been encountered this year crossing our southern border?
Again, I don't have the specific figures, but I know that our field offices down there, all of which I've visited, work very closely with CBP on this issue, and I agree with you that it's a significant security concern.
Well, would you think is a more dangerous threat to our nation's security than, say, whether Rudy Giuliani filed the right paperwork for his lobbying firm?
I really can't discuss any specific individual's investigation.
Can you at least give us the FBI estimate of how many terrorists, criminals, and gang members are among the hundreds of thousands of gotaways that the Border Patrol's been unable to intercept?
Again, I'd be happy to see if I can provide specific numbers and information to be helpful to your request separately. So I'm happy to follow up with your staff on that.
On that point, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy sent you a letter in April requesting a briefing on this subject. Will you commit to keeping Mr. McCarthy, in fact, all members of this committee, fully informed of it?
I believe we have actually, may have already even provided the briefing that you're referring to for Leader McCarthy.
And will you provide that for all members of this committee?
Again, I'll be happy to see what information we can provide to be helpful.
Well, I hope you could provide me all the information.
Again, I have to see what information we can provide, but yes.
Is it true that many of the foreign nationals who are being trafficked across our border often arrive here deeply indebted to the Mexican crime cartels?
Certainly, we have seen quite a number of such instances, absolutely.
Are those debts collected through indentured servitude to the cartels?
In some cases, definitely. You know, we are pursuing, we have a number of human trafficking task forces, as well as working on certain task forces with DHS to try to address that issue. But there's no question that the cartel activity on the other side of the border is spilling over in all sorts of ways, and you just put your finger directly on one that is extremely concerning to us all.
So we basically, 170 plus years after the 13th Amendment, have slavery burgeoning in this country as a result of these policies.
Well, certainly, I do consider human trafficking a form of, and I like
indentured
the word, a modern form of slavery. I mean, it's almost medieval.
Indentured servitude certainly is. How is that, you mentioned out of the country, but in this country, how is that enforced? Do the cartels have gang affiliates who extract these debts?
Well, it varies from case to case. Certainly, the cartels have, different cartels have affiliations with different sorts of gangs here in the United States. There's not just human trafficking from a labor perspective, but also
this
sex
is a
trafficking.
massive organized crime syndicate burgeoning in this country because of these policies. What are you doing about it?
So we are attacking, it's a team effort, right? Obviously, DHS has the primary responsibility for the border itself, but we have Safe Streets task forces that go after the gang activity. We have OCDEF strike forces that go after the
How many agents and how much money are you directing at this threat?
Again, I could see if I could give you specific numbers, but I don't have those off the top of my head. I will tell you, which is sometimes surprising to people, that our criminal programs, our traditional criminal programs, which include exactly the kind of thing you're talking about, remain, even to this day, with all the national security threats that get so much discussion, remain our biggest number of agents, our biggest allocation of resources. And violent crime, different sorts of violent crime within the criminal program is by far and away the biggest chunk.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you, Director Wray, for your service to our country. I want to thank especially the Bureau for the diligence with which you have pursued those who attacked the Capitol and the Capitol Police and essentially attacked our democratic system of government on January 6th. We wish you well in those efforts. I have a couple of questions about the rule of law. We all believe in the rule of law, and we think that, and I know you do too, that the rule of law applies to the government as well. Leads me to a question about Section 702 of the FISA law. As you know, there has been a review by the court on the use of FISA, and as you, I'm sure, know, in its latest review, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court found widespread violations of the FBI's internal rules and the law's restrictions on how and when the government may use the information it collects under Section 702. For example, the court found, and I quote, compliance incidents suggesting that the FBI's failure to properly apply its querying standard when searching 702 acquired information was more pervasive than previously believed. In one case, FBI personnel queried foreign intelligence databases for the names of over 100 business, religious, civic, and community leaders who'd applied to the FBI's Citizen Academy. The court also found dozens of cases where agents had searched warrantless foreign intelligence collections in the course of criminal investigations. In summary, the court expressed concerns about, quote, the apparent widespread violations of safeguards on the use of warrantless collections. In response to all of these criticisms and concerns, the FBI, it seems to me, basically said they had been working on changes, but that had been suspended because of the COVID pandemic protocols. But here's my question, Director Wray. Section 702 was enacted in 2008. The FBI and other intelligence agencies have had more than a decade to implement what the law requires. And yes, it's 2021, and the FISA court is still finding, this isn't the first time, still finding widespread violations and failures where the FBI uses basically the hook of foreign surveillance, but it's using it to avoid its warrant requirements for domestic law enforcement. Why is this happening?
Well, Congressman, I obviously want to make sure, and I'm fiercely committed to making sure, that the FBI complies with FISA in all respects. The FISA court's concerns are certainly concerns that I take especially seriously as somebody who's a former prosecutor, former defense attorney, former assistant attorney general in charge of the criminal division, and now FBI director. Our relationship with, and our candor with, and our transparency with, and the confidence that we earn with the court is of utmost importance to me. Now, the opinion that you are referring to from the court does approve our procedures, did not, in fact, find abuses or misconduct, and has to deal specifically with the querying, the running of searches in our databases. So we have taken.
He also found that you had used, the FBI had used data for internal domestic investigations. That's a violation of the purpose of 702.
And again, I'm not going to speak to the specific instances in the report, because I think that would take longer than we have here, among other things. But I would say that we have done a number of things to try to address the issues identified by the court. We have made significant changes to the documentation requirements to assure accountability, oversight requirements, guidance and training enhancements, systems modifications, which may not sound glamorous, but is incredibly important because it helps prevent noncompliance. And then last but not least, something I particularly want to highlight, I created a whole new department in the FBI, an Office of Internal Auditing, headed by a senior partner from a top, a Big Four accounting firm, who also had prior in his life been an FBI agent, and is consulting with a premier outside world-class consulting firm to stand up an Office of Internal Audit specifically focused on FISA to ensure that we have a world-class compliance program and world-class internal auditing program to make sure that we don't have these
Gentlemen, the gentlelady's time has expired.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, can we get the director to commit to have this individual brief the committee on those procedures?
I'd be happy to see if we can get the committee a briefing on what we're doing in this space.
Thank you. The
Thank you. Yield back.
the gentlelady yields back. Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on my colleague. Apparently, Californians think alike today. In the 20 years that I've sat on the dais and looked at report after report of the FBI failure to comply with FISA and its long history of spying on Americans using this legislation as a backdoor, we've seen a pattern, which is we're promised there are going to be changes, and those changes have not occurred. As the gentlelady who just spoke, Ms. Lofgren, would tell you, you're coming up for reauthorization. If the reauthorization were today, based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, the 2019 report by the Inspector General that found 17 significant errors or omissions and 51 wrong or unsupported factual assertions in Carter Page's domestic spying, if you will, using the FISA statute alone. In addition to that, we have numerous people, including judges, who say if they'd known the truth rather than the false statements, they never would have granted those warrants. So now the question is, should we, first of all, do you agree with those findings that at least some of those 68 errors or omissions are accurate, including one of your own that was prosecuted for it?
Well, Congressman, first, let me be clear, just in case there's any confusion to anybody watching. Of course, all of these applications were filed before I became FBI director.
No,
be clear.
And to be honest, Director, the reason we're having this conversation, Ms. Lofgren and I both, is that it's your watch. And organizations, no matter how great they are much like airplane pilots. They're not judged on their safe landings, they're judged on their crashes. And this was clearly a crash, wouldn't you say?
Well, what I would say is that the Inspector General's report describes conduct that I consider unacceptable, unrepresentative of who the FBI is, and cannot happen again, which is why I implemented over 40 corrective measures promptly after the Inspector General's report came out, accepted every single finding in the Inspector General's report, implemented every single recommendation in the Inspector General's report, went above and beyond, installed an entirely new leadership team at the FBI, created this new Office of Internal Auditing that I just mentioned to Congresswoman Lofgren. I can go on and on and on, but
let me not let you go on and on just because of short time and ask you, what assurances can you give us today that a current audit would not find current failures?
Well, as somebody who's worked deeply with auditing firms for all sorts of organizations, the point of an audit is to find problems. And so I can't sit here and tell you that no audit would find a problem. That's why we have an auditing program, is to find the problems and fix them. And that's what we're going to do.
Okay, some time ago, under your predecessor, he came before this Congress and defended a warrant, an unusual one that ordered the company Apple to develop software to allow for a backdoor, purportedly to be on one iPhone used in San Bernardino by a murderer, a terrorist, but in fact they were asking for software that allowed it to be external. Your predecessor claimed that you did not have the technical capability to decipher it. Shortly after that, a college professor showed that for about $300 you could have done it, and yet you paid $1 million to an Israeli firm who did it. Today, can you assure us that you have the tools that you apparently did not have, or would we have to assume that you'd have to ask a professor for a $300 solution or the Israelis for $1 million solution?
Well, as you could imagine, the technology continues to improve both for the bad guys and for the good guys. And so it's not a static situation. But
well,
even
knowing that there have been 2 recent failures in cyber attacks, what assurances can you give this committee that you have the resources and a plan to be on the leading edge of cyber rather than the trailing edge of cyber, which appears to be where we are in a number of areas?
We constantly need more resources to get further and further ahead of the bad guys in this particular space. The technology in terms of encryption, which is sort of the point you're getting at with the Apple example, has continued to advance in a way that's actually making it harder and harder for law enforcement, not just the FBI, but all across this country, to get into encrypted devices and certainly encrypted messaging platforms. We saw that, for example, down in Congressman Gates's district in Pensacola with the Naval Air Station attack there. And we tried to get into Apple's iPhone, the device that the terrorists there used. And by the way, he took the time in the middle of the attack to shoot the phone. Think about the presence of mind that he has to have in the middle of that to do that, to try to prevent us from getting into his phone. Our folks were able, in that instance, to reconstruct the phone. And because of a fluke in that particular instance, we were able to actually get into the device. But it took months and months and months and hours and hours and hours and hours and lots of taxpayer money to get there. And only then, after not having gotten the cooperation that we really could have used from Apple at the front end, we found out that that particular terrorist had been in communication with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula right on up till the night before the attack, not known at the time that the attack was disrupted. So it's an illustration of what a challenge this is for law enforcement, and it affects terrorist investigations. It affects an issue that I know is near and dear to every member of this committee, child sexual exploitation investigations. And it's something that I hear about. I've been to talk to law enforcement in all 50 states, and I hear about it from chiefs and sheriffs in every state about this issue. So it is top of mind. We are bringing technical tools, using the money that Congress appropriates to us to deal with it. We're moving in a direction where we're going darker and darker, so I appreciate very much your concern.
The gentleman's time is well expired. Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service and the FBI agents across the nation. Since 2019, the United States has experienced a steep rise in hate crimes. African Americans have been targeted in 48.5% of all hate crimes, while hate incidences targeting Latinx have risen 8.7%. Anti-Semitic hate incidents have risen by 14%, and anti-Asian hate incidents have risen by nearly 150%. Director Wray, my time is short. These questions should give just a brief response. Is the Bureau prioritizing its investigations into violent hate crimes?
Yes, very much so. And I could give you more information. It just depends on how much you would like here.
You'll have an opportunity. What percentage of domestic terrorism cases investigated by the FBI would you now say are motivated by white supremacist type ideology?
Well, I'm not sure that I could give you a percentage. Certainly on the domestic terrorism side, we have elevated, I did back in summer of 2019, racially motivated violent extremism to our very top threat priority band, consistent with ISIS. And the biggest chunk of that, by far and away, the vast majority of that, is racially motivated violent extremists advocating for the superior.
And you would say that's still today?
Yes.
Thank you. Now let's direct our attention to the beating of law enforcement in Washington on January 6th. On January 6th, the domestic terrorists who beat law enforcement officers and breached the citadel of democracy of the United States wore insignias of white supremacist groups, waved Confederate flags, hung a noose on the lawn, and they were shouting racial epithets. As indicated, NYPD sent a packet of raw intelligence concerning potential violence. Why did the FBI not issue a formal threat assessment with all of that information, including an assessment at headquarters?
Well, I don't know about a formal threat assessment. As I was mentioning in response to an earlier question, we did put out quite a number, I think a dozen or so, intelligence products specifically geared towards domestic violent extremism and election-related domestic violent extremism.
On that day? On January 6th?
Over the course of 20, leading up to and right on up to and including December, the month.
Can I get that in writing as to the details of how that progressed and whether there was a threat assessment on that day? I need to move on, and I thank you very much. You know that the Norfolk FBI office, as indicated, had an SIR report, Situational Information Report. These are the words: be ready to fight. Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in, and blood from their BLM, Black Lives Matter, and Antifa slave soldiers being spilled. Get violent. Stop calling this a march or a rally or a protest. Get ready for war. Would you agree that these words clearly could indicate racial bias and an attempt to use race and racism as a potential motive for violence?
Well, I'm not sure I tracked all the words in the quote that you read, but certainly the Norfolk Situational Information Report, the information that was online was concerning enough that it was provided, as I said, within.
It had Black Lives Matter, slave soldiers. That has some racial overtones.
Absolutely, of course.
Let me, as you well know, you've just heard me recount the Norfolk, the NYPD. Was the FBI aware of any online threats to the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and specific members of Congress connected with January 6th?
Well, I can't think of any sitting here right now. Certainly, we were aware of and discussed a lot of online chatter that was out there.
I'm going to move on. Thank you.
But I'm not aware of any.
On the day of, did headquarters contact the Vice President? Did they contact the Speaker of the House? And did they contact FBI contact any member of Congress on the day of, January 6th?
Did any member of the FBI have any
Yes.
contact with any member of
Headquarters, I'm
Congress?
going to speak of, your office.
Well, I know that there was interaction between,
I'm going to ask for that in writing as well, maybe,
Okay.
yes, and thank you. Let me go to the connection of race and the President of the United States, former President. On December 19th, the former President indicated big protests in D.C. on January 6th. There will be wild. 12:15 on January 6th, he said, "You'll never take back our country with weakness." At 1:10 p.m., President Trump said, "We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." At 2:11, rioters breached police lines on the west side of the Capitol. Director Wray, these words do indicate that the former President, Donald Trump, helped motivate the domestic terrorist attack on January 6th. Have any of these words been reviewed to determine whether or not President Trump words and deeds should be referred to the Department of Justice as contributing to the violence of the insurrectionists on January 6th?
Gentlelady's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
I'm not sure there's a whole lot I can add on that subject, but if there's something I can provide in follow-up, I'm happy to.
I asked if you referred these actions or deeds of the President, you're the investigatory agency, to the Department of Justice. Donald Trump's actions, words, deeds on that day.
I'm not aware of any investigation that specifically goes to that, but we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of investigations related to January 6th involving lots and lots of different pieces of it, and I want to be careful not to speak with
Well, maybe I can
absolutes
get that
about a
back in
massive
writing.
investigation.
I thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I might just put on the record for a letter back, there are only 4.7% African Americans in the FBI. Much has come to my attention of the lack of promotion opportunities for leadership in the FBI, and the diversity office that you now have does not report directly to the FBI director. Would you please provide me in writing where we are with diversity in the FBI and as it relates to minorities and specifically African Americans?
Gentlelady.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Gomer.
Thank you. Director Wray, we know from the Arizona case, the Supreme Court said that state, local law enforcement were not to enforce immigration laws. But isn't it true that local and state law enforcement officers can enforce state and local law if, even if the defendant is in the country illegally?
Well, I want to be a little bit careful since the last time I looked at that issue was back in the 2001, 2, 3 range when I was a lawyer at the Justice Department. But
Look,
my
my
recollection
time is very short.
My
It's an
recollection
easy
is similar
question.
to yours. My recollection is similar to yours, but I'm
Yes.
not speaking
Well,
as a lawyer right now.
Okay, it is the case, and I hope you'll refresh your recollection and your legal training. So it seems that since the federal government is welcoming, basically, by its tactics, by its handling of the massive surge across our border, in such a way to continue to encourage it, that there is massive destruction to landowners' property. It sounds like, understanding the criminal trespass laws of Texas, that perhaps landowners on the border ought to have no trespassing signs, including in Spanish, so that local law enforcement can protect the country while they're protecting the local property owners. There was a question about also the FISA court, and I'm still, as a former judge, particularly disturbed that no FISA judge felt strongly enough about people not lying in applications for warrants that they took action for contempt of court. But should DOJ officials that sign applications for warrants before the FISA court actually read them before they certify that they're true and correct?
Certainly, it's my practice when, as FBI director, I'm signing applications to.
You do read them?
I do review them, yes, absolutely.
And I would commend you for that, and I would ask you to look into.
They're not short, by the way.
Yeah, and they're usually lengthy.
Yeah.
But I would commend your looking into Mr. Rosenstein's inability to testify that he actually read those regarding the Trump campaign before he signed them. The night before January 6th, January 5th, that evening I was talking to Capitol Police officers, and I said, you know, let's face it, most of the conservatives that come, they don't have any intention of being violent. And they said, well, we've been briefed today that there's a good bit of, it's understood, online activity, that there are people that are going to be coming that hate Trump, but they're going to dress up in red, MAGA, Trump paraphernalia to try to blend in and create trouble. We had Capitol Police Chief Son testify that they got no information from U.S. Intel or from the DOJ, FBI, of any threat of the nature that came about. Did the FBI have information about the violent threat that occurred on January 6th, on January 5th?
Well, the answer to that is complicated, unfortunately. So we've already talked about a little bit here this morning.
It shouldn't be complicated. You either had information or you didn't. That was my question.
So there's different kinds of information. We had the online chatter that we just talked about, and the so-called Norfolk SIR, Situational Information Report, has that. But what we did not have, to my knowledge—
Did you pass any of that information on to Chief Sund?
We passed the Norfolk information onto the Capitol Police in 3 different ways, as well as to
Okay.
MPD.
Well, you were careful to note that most of the protesters who were leftists last summer were basically peaceful, but you haven't said that about the 100,000, 200,000 people that showed up on January 6th. Do you know how many people actually came into the Capitol on January 6th that were unauthorized?
I don't have an exact number. I do know that we've now are approaching around 500 arrests. But to be clear, to your point about peaceful, the way I think is a fair description of January 6th is there's sort of 3 groups of people, almost like an inverse pyramid. First group, biggest number of people who showed up kind of outside, maybe not on the Capitol grounds, were peaceful, maybe rowdy, but peaceful protesters. Then there's a second group that were people who, for whatever reason, engaged in, let's say, the next level of criminal conduct, trespass, et cetera. And that is criminal, that is a violation, and those laws need to be enforced. And then there's the third group, which is where you're seeing a lot of the arrests and a lot of the more significant charges that are coming out of our work right now, which are the people who brought all sorts of weapons, Kevlar, tactical vests, bear spray.
Firearms?
What's that?
Anybody bring firearms?
Gentlemen,
I can think of at least one instance where there was an individual with a gun inside the Capitol, but for the most part, the weapons were weapons other than firearms. But there's 3 groups, and it's hard to paint with one broad brush every single individual.
the gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen is on mute.
Mr. Cohen?
I'm unmuted now.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray. You've done an admirable job so far, foot soldiers in the January 6th insurrection. Kind of like going after Al Capone and getting all of the lottery sales tickets, the people that do the bootlegging in the street. You, to the best of my knowledge, haven't done anything to go after the people who incited the riot, the big bosses, the leaders, which is Donald Trump. Do you have any investigation or have you done anything to look into Trump's activities on the day of the insurrection, subpoena records of the White House, of phone calls in and out, and of meetings that he and Roger Stone and others may have had with leaders of these groups?
Well, again, Congressman, somewhat along the lines of something I said earlier, because we have not one, but now close to 500 pending criminal cases, all of which are in the hands of judges who feel very strongly about how much I discuss pending cases. I want to be careful about that. We have brought, in addition to what you're describing as kind of the lower level type offenses, we have now started to bring a number of conspiracy charges of various individuals. Yes, I think there's about 30+ individuals who have been charged with conspiracy.
Ray,
Yes, sir.
I appreciate and understand that, but I'm talking about Mr. Big, number one. Have you gone after the people who incited the riot?
Well, I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to be discussing whether or not we are or aren't investigating specific individuals. I just don't think that's appropriate.
I'll accept that and understand that, but I would urge you to do it. He said, come to Washington on the day of the Electoral College, a month earlier, no other day. And he said, it will be big and it will be wild. I read that as violence to occur. And I was with a Capitol policeman on Sunday who said, yes, they had information that said it was going to be violent. You and the FBI did not make the case. You should have warned, and you had a duty to do that. Let me ask you this. Have you seen Mr. McGahn's testimony yet?
No, sir.
I urge you to look. I don't know if you can do anything without the direction of the Attorney General, but it appears Mr. McGahn was told to lie by the president about wanting to fire officials that would have resulted in obstruction of justice. I urge you to look at it. Can you act on that testimony independent of the Attorney General?
Well, I think we have very specific rules about predication and approval on certain kinds of investigations, so I'd have to look at whatever information you wanted to send our way, and we can take a look at the information and evaluate whether or not there's action we could take.
It's in the deposition, and it's clear that McGahn said that the president told him to lie, and the president also lied. I would urge you to look at that and talk to Director Garland, Attorney General Garland, about that. Did you infiltrate the crowds of the BLM Black Lives Matter protest in Washington when they were in Washington?
Congressman, we don't infiltrate protests as a general rule, certainly. When it comes to criminal activity, we have specific rules covered by the Attorney General guidelines and the so-called DIAG, which is our implementation of the Attorney General guidelines that cover what we can and cannot do. And we would have followed those scrupulously, not just in general, but in the specific period that you're talking about. We don't investigate First Amendment activity. We investigate threats of criminal activity.
Thank you, Director. I know First Amendment activity is protected, but was your activities on January 6th different from what it was with Black Lives Matter? Did you observe? Did you try to get more knowledge about what was going on after you had the Norfolk information about the January 6th insurrection?
Well, the Norfolk information that we've talked about here arrived essentially the night before or the afternoon before January 6th and was promptly passed on. At that point, it was raw, unverified information that we hadn't yet had a chance to vet. But of course, we decided that even though it was raw and unverified, we needed to pass it on to all of our partners, both in the command post and throughout the Joint Terrorism Task Force, to make sure they had it.
Director Wray, thank you. I only have a few seconds left. You have compared ransomware to 9/11. Ransomware is awful and it's a problem. 9/11 was awful. But the insurrection on our Capitol, unlike anything known since the Civil War, is also awful. Where would you compare the insurrection? And would you admit that it was an insurrection on our Capitol with the assault on our country on January 11th?
The gentleman's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first, let me just say that I don't think any attack, ransomware or January 6th, can fairly be compared to the horror of September 11th and the 3,000 or so individuals who lost their lives that day. And that attack and my engagement with the victims in my last time in government was a big part of why I came back into this role in the first place. My reference to September 11th in context of ransomware was not about the attack, but about how the country came together in response. Now, certainly, when it comes to January 6th, It's a unique type of attack, not just in terms of the number of individuals, but in terms of the effort to disrupt a key part of our constitutional system and the peaceful transition of government, which is such a hallmark of our country. So it's a very significant attack in of its own right, and certainly we have, as we've already talked about, close to 500 arrests. We have all of our field offices fully engaged, and the amount of manpower devoted to it is extremely significant for one attack, absolutely.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you. Director Wray, since you last testified before this committee, our country has faced increased threats, be it malware and ransomware to our computer networks, gang members crossing our southern border and committing horrific crimes here within the United States, groups like Antifa attempting to burn down federal courthouses, the January 6th attack, as we've mentioned, on the Capitol, and the surge of illicit drugs killing so many Americans. We are facing multiple national security threats, all of which need the full attention of agencies like the one that you oversee, the FBI. I'll first ask you about cyber attacks. Ransomware terrorists have brazenly disrupted the operations of countless hospitals, schools, city governments, emergency services, even our congressional offices, and an untold number of businesses because they typically pay the ransom quietly. Last fall, cyber criminals were able to compromise patient records and personal information from a hospital and a senior living community in my district. And more recently, high-profile ransomware attacks on Colonial Pipeline and JBS, a meat processing company, caused major disruptions to our oil and food supply. I've seen it estimated that there's a victim of a ransomware attack every 11 seconds, that they're already costing us $20 billion a year, and that you've compared the challenge, as Mr. Cohen mentioned, to the September 11th, 2001 attack on our nation. Mr. Director, the Biden administration basically, I mentioned the attack on the Colonial Pipeline, basically gave a wink and a nod to paying off the thugs. And I know some of that money was gotten back, but don't we need to clarify the policy relative to paying off criminals? Aren't we just inviting more attacks when you pay off these thugs?
Well, Congressman, I appreciate the question, and I share your concern about, and that's partly why I've made some of the comments that I've made publicly about the effect of ransomware and the threat that it poses and the challenge and what it requires from all of us to deal with it. It is our policy, it is our guidance from the FBI that companies should not pay the ransom for a number of reasons. One, the one that you mentioned, which is that it encourages more of this kind of activity. But then there's second, some more practical issues, which sometimes the encryption or the locking up of the system that the actors engage in may not be undone. You could pay the ransom and not get your system back, and that's not unknown to happen. But the third and the most important thing is whether the company pays or not, what we really need is to make sure that the companies or other organizations who are victimized reach out and coordinate with the FBI and with our partners as quickly and promptly as possible. And it's when they do that, enables us to take all sorts of creative action that we can't always do, but that certain cases we can, and speed matters, which is why, for example, in the Colonial instance, we were able to essentially seize and confiscate the clear majority of the ransom that was extracted. In other cases, again, not common, but it does happen, we're able to actually get the encryption keys and unlock the system even without the company paying the ransom. And so the whole bunch of things we can do to prevent this activity from occurring if, whether they pay the ransom or not, they communicate and coordinate and work closely with law enforcement right out of the gate. That's, I think, is the most important part.
Thank you, Mr. Director. I got two more questions. I only have time for one. The Centers for Disease Control announced that there's been an increase in overdose deaths the prevalence of fentanyl is the main thing. Comes from China, comes across our southern border. Myself, I, and Bob Latta have introduced legislation relative to fentanyl analogs, which are very similar, can be changed. They get around the law with that. But my question to you is relative to fentanyl and the analogs as well. The chaos at our southern border, doesn't this play right into the drug cartels, the current policies down there on the southern border? Isn't more of that drug coming in and killing far too many Americans? Don't we really need to control that southern border?
Well, I absolutely agree that the security situation at the southwest border is of great concern, both from a perspective of drug trafficking, human trafficking, violence on both sides of the border, corruption, et cetera. And certainly we are trying to do our part to contribute to that because, as you mentioned, the scourge of opioids, opioid abuse, fentanyl in particular, is something that is sweeping the country, and I know that in your home state that's a particularly significant concern. We, from our end, are trying to attack the problem through a variety of means. We're going after not just the professionals, the prescribers from that end of it. We're going after the dark web where it's trafficked there. We're going after the gangs that distributed here locally. We're going after the source through our transnational organized crime efforts. So there's a whole bunch of things that we're doing with our partners, but make no mistake, this goes beyond, way beyond law enforcement into other agencies and frankly, the community as well.
Gentleman's time is
Thank you. My
expired.
time expired.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, I want to thank you for appearing before us today and also for your service to the nation. As I was preparing for this hearing, I researched hate crimes data for my state of Georgia, and I was troubled by the data that I found, or more precisely, what I didn't find. We clearly have a deeply flawed system for collecting hate crimes data, which has left us with unreliable and incomplete counts. The hesitation to report, investigate, and designate incidents as hate crimes demonstrates a deep-rooted failure of our justice system. One thing is clear. Since the start of the pandemic, we've seen a significant rise in anti-Asian and anti-Chinese rhetoric. And in March of this year, 8 people were tragically murdered in a mass shooting in Atlanta, and 6 of those individuals murdered were women of Asian descent. At a press conference the next day, a police official famously told those assembled that the shooter had, quote, had a bad day, end quote. And Director Wray, 2 days after the murders, you said in an interview with NPR, quote, while the motive remains still under investigation at the moment, it does not appear that the motive was racially motivated, end quote. Many people believe, Director Wray, that law enforcement reluctance to designate a homicide as a hate crime does a disservice to the victims and fails to prevent similar future crimes. Certainly, comments such as yours during an ongoing investigation do not help the cause. Wasn't it inappropriate for you, sir, to infer to the press that you didn't believe that the murders of the 6 Asian women was a hate crime when, as you said, the motive was still under investigation?
Well, certainly, as you know, Congressman, because that's my home city as well, my heart aches for the victims of that attack, and I grieve with their families. In the instance in question, I think the comment I made was consistent with the information we had at the time, but I regret if anyone's reaction to that was otherwise.
Well, I submit to you, sir, that such comments by the director of the FBI were not only harmful to the ongoing investigation, but also diminished already waning community confidence in law enforcement. I want to shift now to another issue. Under current law, only those convicted of domestic terrorism-related felonies or hate crimes are prohibited from possessing firearms, but those convicted of misdemeanors that have a nexus to domestic terrorism or misdemeanor hate crimes may possess firearms without restriction. Would you agree that Congress should consider expanding the prohibition on the possession of firearms to those convicted of violent misdemeanors that are related to domestic terrorism and are violent hate crimes?
Well, I don't think I'm in a position as FBI director to comment on specific legislative proposals, but I'm happy to provide operational input to you if, or have the FBI do so with your staff. Certainly, I share the goal of making sure that those who are prohibited by law from possessing firearms don't get their hands on the firearms, and certainly to the extent that there are things that can be done to protect the public, we want to do that. That's why our NICS section up in West Virginia processed, and last year processed, I think, a record almost 40 million background checks of firearms right through the middle of the pandemic. So we are trying to do our part to make sure that the laws on the books related to firearms are enforced and that those who are not supposed to have firearms don't get them. Individual states
okay,
have
let
individual laws
me stop you there. I got one more issue I want to talk about. When you were here last year, you mentioned the creation of the Domestic Terrorism Hate Crimes Fusion Cell. Can you provide us with some insight into how the Fusion Cell operates? And to be clear, is it just one cell or are there multiple cells?
I appreciate very much the question. So this is something that I stood up about a year and a half or so ago, bringing together the domestic terrorism expertise that we have together with the hate crimes expertise which we have, which is more in the civil rights program. And together, the goal was to try to be more proactive and to try to do a better job of anticipating and preventing hate crimes. And so, for example, we're very proud of the success that that cell helped create in Colorado, where we were able to prevent an attack, a hate crime against a synagogue, I've forgotten the city in Colorado, but that was a big part of what came out of that fusion cell. The fusion cell is one cell in headquarters, but it works with all of our field offices and helps coordinate that effort. And again, the whole goal is to try to be ahead of the threat. That's the point of it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There has been a cover-up regarding the origins of coronavirus. We see it in the Fauci emails. We see it in the G7's call today to renew an inquiry into those origins. We see it in the Biden administration's efforts to squelch investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. And I want to figure out what side the FBI is on. On April 28th, Dr. Li Mingyan landed at LAX. One of your agents interviewed her at that time. She then traveled to New York. Your agent from Los Angeles followed her to New York and sought an interview on both the 1st of May and the 2nd of May in 2020. The FBI took Dr. Li Mingyan's phone, on which the doctor showed evidence of WeChat communications between herself and the director of the CDC in Beijing, all the way dating back to December of 2019, regarding the Chinese military's involvement in the development of the virus and specific links to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Director Wray, when did you become aware of your agency's interface with Dr. Yang? When did you review those WeChat messages?
I'm not sure that there's much I can say about any specific investigation. I will say that a couple things. One, as I think you know, and I think the committee knows, I have been very vocal, and I intend to continue to be very vocal about the counterintelligence threat, which takes a wide variety of forms from the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's one of the most significant threats facing this country.
Is Dr. Yan part of that threat?
Well, again, don't want to speak specifically about any particular investigation. But the second thing I would mention is that...
Well, here's why that's important. Yeah. On the first thing, Director Wray, back in April and May of 2020, we didn't have nearly 600,000 people dead as a result of the coronavirus. On October 14th, 2020, FBI agent Andrew Zitman brought a scientist who was working with the FBI to meet with Dr. Yan. in New York on October 14th. They met for nearly 6 hours. Can you tell us anything about that meeting and what it tells us about the origins of this virus? It is simply unacceptable to sit here a year later and say you're not going to tell us whether or not there was information about the origins of the virus when it is so central to the safety and health of our fellow Americans.
I certainly understand the point of the question. Again, I have to be careful not to discuss specific investigations. I will say that in addition to our investigative work, as I think has been recently publicly stated by the DNI, and I think even the President himself, the intelligence community has been looking at this issue. There are differences of view within the intelligence community about the origins of the coronavirus.
Totally understand all that. I'm trying to resolve those differences
deeper
with these
dive on that
questions, though.
subject.
Director Wray, we are unable to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable if we throw our hands in the air and say, well, there's differences of opinion. We have to assess whether those differences are similarly rooted in fact. That's why I need the facts from you. Will you provide to this committee any scientific analysis that the FBI has done regarding Dr. Yan's claims, regarding the messages she provided to you, regarding Beijing's knowledge of the origins of this virus, their military's involvement, and even efforts to try to present to the world a fake genome sequence at the beginning of these developments?
I'm happy to see what information we can provide. I will have my staff follow up with yours and see what information we can share on the subject.
You get that if we don't look at that rooted information, we're unable to ascertain what differences of opinion are correct and incorrect. But it's hard to believe that the FBI didn't believe Dr. Yan was credible or significant because she lands on April 28th. Your agent, Dana Murphy, takes her phone that day. I'm holding the receipt from where you got the phone that had the WeChat messages that had very important information regarding Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. And it's not every day that an FBI agent flies from Los Angeles to New York to follow a Chinese doctor who is a whistleblower and a fact witness. And even if Dr. Yan's technical analysis of the virus is incorrect, the fact that she showed up saying that she wanted to provide information and tell the truth seems significant today. Now, back when Dr. Yan made these pronouncements regarding the Chinese Communist Party, their military involvement, the leak of this virus from the lab, we had a number of people trying to discredit her. Are you able to ascertain whether or not that effort to discredit Dr. Yan is part of the counterintelligence efforts by the Chinese Communist Party?
Again, I want to be careful both about what information we can provide in general about any kind of ongoing investigation, but also about what form that information would take, because in some cases, you may be touching on things that would be classified, and that might require a different format. So I certainly understand why you're asking the questions. Let me commit to you that I will go back with my folks and see what information can be provided and what form it would have to take if we can provide any.
That would be very helpful.
The gentleman's time is expired, Mr. Deutsch.
Oh, wait, hold on, Mr. Chairman. You let everybody else go over for a minute. May I be recognized just for unanimous consent request?
The gentleman's time is expired,
You're not
Mr.
treating
Deutsch.
everyone equally, Mr. Chairman. You went over by more than
Gentleman's
a minute.
time.
Mr. Johnson went over by 45 seconds.
Gentleman's time is expired, Mr. Deutsch. What?
I just want a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You want a unanimous consent for what?
To get a document
Okay, I'm sorry.
Just a UC is all.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the receipt from the United States Department of Justice wherein Dr. Yang's phone was taken by FBI agent Dana Murphy.
Without objection, the gentleman's time is expired, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, first, I want to thank you and all the men and women of the FBI for what you do every day to keep us safe. I also want to extend my condolences, my sympathy to the families of Special Agent Alphen and Special Agent Schwarzenberger, who were shot and killed while serving a warrant in Sunrise, Florida, just south of my district. I also, Director Wray, would like to just follow up on some of the things that you've touched on today. First of all, you said just a little while ago that 9/11 was why you returned to public service. And I just wanted to follow up on that. The 9/11 community, as you know, Director Wray, has asked the FBI to conduct a full and complete declassification review of all documents related to the September 11th attacks. It has been nearly 20 years now since that horrific day. And these families, the American people, I think, deserve this. And so I would just ask whether you will commit to conducting a full and complete declassification review.
We are working very hard on trying to declassify as much information as we can and to share as much information as we can. I understand why this is frustrating to any number of families, and we will commit to continuing to try to provide as much information as we responsibly can.
I would urge you to pursue a full declassification review. I want to just follow up on your responses, both to Chairman Nadler and to Mr. Cohen about the Norfolk memo. You said that we tried to make sure the information got to the right people. You said you tried 3 ways. You emailed it to Capitol Police. You did a verbal briefing in command post, including Capitol Police, and that you used the law enforcement portal that all law enforcement partners have access to. You then went on to tell Mr. Cohen that the information arrived essentially, I think you said, the night or afternoon before January 6th, and was promptly passed on, but it was raw, unverified. We decided that even though it was raw and unverified, we needed to pass it on to all of our partners, which you did. You didn't explain, and I would ask you to explain what happened next. Well, you passed it on, and what did you do to follow up with this really important information about what may take place the next day in the United States Capitol?
Well, I'm not sure that there's specific investigative activity that I could discuss. I think the point of passing this information on, we didn't know what to make of it, and that's why I emphasized that it was raw, unverified information without a specific identity attached to it. But the judgment was made, which is not the way we prefer to have to do things, but given the framing of the information, we decided out of an abundance of caution to pass it on to, and sometimes when there's a reference to the email, it's important to understand we're talking about their chosen representatives on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the whole purpose of which is to keep people in the loop. Yes?
I understand, and I understand that's their purpose. You had a memo that said that the report that detailed online posts said that individuals in Washington were ready for war at the Capitol, called for potential, it talked about potential for violence in Washington, D.C. in connection with planned Stop the Steal protest on January 6th. That's what was in the memo. I know you passed it on. What do you do once you passed it on? And I'm asking the question because we're not, we don't know what the answer is. We know that this was out there. We don't know whether you did anything other than pass it on through these channels, and it was damning enough information, certainly it seems in retrospect, that though raw, you would have then followed up to make sure that every step was followed once you passed on the information. So what happened after you passed it on?
Well, I guess the way we look at it is we passed it on not 1, not 2, but 3 different ways in order to make sure that it got through to the people who needed to have that information to exercise their responsibilities to engage in the physical security, which is not what we do. I may be missing the point of your question.
I think so. Director Wray, respectfully, I think you are. When you say it's not your responsibility to ensure physical security, you had this memo that foretold or at least suggested what might happen. And I'm going to finish with this, Director Wray. The reason this is so upsetting to me in particular is because it just reminds me too much of the 2 tips that the FBI got before the mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. One to someone in Mississippi who saw a troubling YouTube comment, the other after receiving a 13-minute-long voicemail with troubling details about the shooter. That was closed as having said there was no lead value. I understand you thought that this was worth passing on, but it seems like there should have been more than simply saying it was the night before, it came in late, we just passed it on through our channels. That's all we really have responsibility to do. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, you articulated in your opening statement that perhaps the top concern in our country right now is the prevalence of violence and violent crime in our communities, and I think we all agree with that. One of the other serious concerns that we have is the decreasing amount of faith that many Americans have in our institutions. And Among the most important of our institutions in America, of course, is our system of justice. And over the past few years, millions of Americans have begun to question whether we can still rely upon the maxim of equal justice under law and whether justice is blind and all the rest. One of the reasons for this is the very real perception that some individuals within the DOJ and FBI have abused their authority and engaged in selective enforcement of certain statutes. One example that comes to mind is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So I wanted to ask you if you're aware that during Special Counsel Mueller's probe, there were at least 5 indictments of conservatives under FARA, and if you know how that compares to the prevalence of previous FARA prosecutions since the enactment of that statute more than 80 years ago.
I'm probably not the right person to provide a whole lot of information about Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. I'd rather, that's probably better referred to what's left of that office, I suppose. But certainly FARA that you're referring to is an extremely important tool that we in the FBI have been pushing for a while to be using more aggressively, in particular against the Chinese threat, because so much of it is reflected through people engaged in activity that we think could appropriately be pursued under FARA. So exactly how it compares, I'm not sure I have that information.
Well, here's the point. We agree with that, and I think we need to be aggressive against the CCP for sure. We're all on the same page there. But according to reports, there were as many FARA prosecutions during the previous 40 years as there were during the 18 months of the Mueller probe. George Papadopoulos, for example, stated that he was given the choice to either, quote, accept the charge that I lied or face FARA charges, and that while FARA has been widely ignored for years, the Special Counsel's Office has dusted the statute off as a prime weapon to get members of the Trump circle to talk, right, unquote. The FBI and the Justice Department used FARA throughout their investigation into Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, but nothing ever came from those charges. The Justice Department stated in its motion to dismiss the case that the FBI's closing communication, quote, made clear that the FBI had found no basis to predicate further investigative efforts into whether Mr. Flynn was being directed and controlled by a foreign power, Russia in that case, in a manner that threatened U.S. national security or violated FARA or its related statutes, unquote. So the question is, it seems to a lot of Americans that alleged FARA violations were used as either a pretext to investigate those with ties to President Trump, or that FARA charges were used to pressure those conservatives in a bid to find a connection between the Trump campaign and Russia. So regardless of the details of the Mueller probe, I get that you're not the expert on that. The question is, how could anyone see this otherwise? Doesn't it look like that was selective enforcement?
I certainly understand the purpose of the question, the point of the question. I'm not sure that I can really speak to what people would perceive. What I can say is that, again, separate from the Special Counsel's investigation, which is really, respectfully, probably not my place to comment on, I do think that more aggressive use of the Foreign Agents Registration Act is something that former Attorney General Barr and I, for example, discussed quite a bit, and trying to use it more aggressively than it had been used in the past, partly for the reason we've already talked about.
On June 3rd of this year, Politico reported that the Justice Department is now investigating a Democrat lobbying firm for failing to comply with FARA and its representation of Burisma Holdings while Hunter Biden served on its board. And up until about a week ago, when this news was first reported, there was a very real perception that enhanced enforcement is being used only against Republicans and conservatives. So the question is, can you confirm the FBI's commitment to fervently pursue these violations, as you said, more aggressively, but to do it regardless of the political party affiliations of the subject of the investigation?
I think political party affiliations should have zero place in our decision to enforce the Foreign Agents Registration Act or any other statute. And you can be sure that as long as I have anything to say about it, we're going to enforce it in an even-handed way without respect to anybody's political affiliation.
I got 19 seconds left. I'll just say that even hand in this perception that we're talking about is increasingly important in our republic, because if people if they don't have faith in the system of justice, if they think that Lady Justice is the symbol, has the blindfold up and she's peering beneath it, then we lose an important element that holds the republic together. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you for your time.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Bass.
First of all, thank you very much for your service, Director Wray. And I also want to thank you for finally abandoning the category of Black identity extremists likely motivated to target law enforcement. My understanding now is that there is a new category, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. And I'm actually concerned about this as well. And I'm concerned about it because of the FBI's long history of collapsing Black activism in the fight for civil rights, and especially against police abuse, with terrorism. So even in this document, several Black individuals and one organization is included along with well-known white supremacist domestic organizations, domestic terrorist organizations. The FBI says from 2015 through 2019, approximately 846 individuals were arrested for domestic terrorism. And I wanted to know how many of these were African American.
Congresswoman, I appreciate your comments about the changes we made in response to some of the conversations we had early in my tenure on the so-called BIE issue. The particular document you're reading from, I'm not sure sitting here right now that I'm certain which document you're referring to, so maybe the best thing to do there would be for us to have my staff follow up with yours and be sure that I'm answering. Yeah.
Let me ask you several other questions. Do you know of any Black domestic terrorist organizations? Could you tell me their names and what attacks that they have landed? I wanted to know if you consider, or if the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter is considered a racially motivated violent extremist organization.
I appreciate the question, because this is something that I think is important for me to be able to clarify really across the spectrum. So the first point that's really important here is that we don't designate domestic terrorist organizations, period. Unlike on the foreign terrorist enforcement side, where there's a specific statutory scheme for designating terrorist organizations, there is no such scheme for domestic terrorism, whether it's on the in the end that you're talking about or any other end. Having said this, but can I? Sorry.
Organizations as domestic terrorists?
Sorry.
White, Black, or otherwise?
I couldn't hear you flickered out there.
You don't, you just said you don't designate organizations as domestic terrorist organizations?
That's correct. What we do is investigate individuals with proper predication. In some instances, those individuals will conspire or engage in criminal conduct with each other. And in some cases, we will open a conspiracy investigation or a so-called enterprise investigation.
Do you have investigations of Black individuals or activists that are involved in the movement around police abuse or civil rights in those categories? And the reason why I'm asking that is because there's a number of Black Lives Matter individuals, leaders, who have been visited regularly by the FBI in their homes, who have been asked about their plans for various protests, et cetera. Some of those individuals might not be aware that if they misrepresent certain facts to the FBI, that they could in fact be committing a crime. And so I wanted to ask you specifically about your surveillance of these organizations. And it's my understanding that there were a couple of protests where the FBI did surveillance and used surveillance aircraft, actually, with organizations that were protesting in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore.
So we're talking about a few different things here. So the first thing is we do investigate individuals for criminal activity that occur and violence that occurs in the middle of protests, regardless of what the basis of their protest is. And I really can't speak to specific cases because I would need to know the facts, and I would also need to make sure that I wasn't talking about an ongoing investigation. We do not investigate First Amendment groups. We don't investigate people for speech, for association, for assembly, for membership in domestic First Amendment groups. We have had a few cases that I can think of off the top of my head in the last 2 years involving individuals who committed domestic, we would consider domestic terror attacks, justifying their attacks, lethal attacks I should add, justifying their attacks based on their interpretation of the so-called Black Hebrew Israelite faith. So that's probably the best example that I could give you, but that's about the only thing that comes to mind as we're sitting here talking right now.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Buck?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for your service to our country. And I want to personally thank you for the great work of the FBI and the case that you mentioned earlier, the synagogue in Colorado. Director Wray, I think it's important that the world knows that the people on this committee, certainly I, condemn white nationalism, white supremacy, Nazis, and I don't think anybody accepts the fact many of our relatives, my father fought in World War II to rid this planet from the scourge of Nazi Germany and Nazis generally, and it's upsetting to see any form of Nazi philosophy come back in this country or anywhere else. But there is, in the chairman's opening statement and in some other comments, there seems to be this link between white nationalists, white supremacists, Nazis, and hate crimes, as if only white supremacists commit hate crimes. I have seen a number of videos online recently, and it appears to me that hate crimes are much broader than that, and I want to get into some other questions, but if you could just let me know, is it true that the only hate crimes committed in this country are committed by white nationalists?
No, certainly we've seen hate crimes committed by a variety of individuals.
Okay, and one of the concerns I have, and I agree with my friend Mr. Johnson from Louisiana's comments about the perception in the public about the even-handedness of law enforcement. I was in law enforcement for 25 years. I feel very strongly about the public perception of law enforcement. And I think that one of the challenges that we face, we have two very high-profile, one a one-day riot and one a series of riots last summer. And it appears to the public that those activities have been treated differently by the FBI and by law enforcement. Oftentimes, I think the riots involving Antifa and other groups over the summer in Portland and cities across the United States were handled by local law enforcement and not necessarily by the FBI. But because there appears to be a concerted and coordinated effort, it seems to me that the FBI would have a role in investigating those activities. And I just want to give you the opportunity to talk about the fact that you have 500, as you mentioned today, prosecutions of the January 6th events at the United States Capitol, and yet we don't see the leadership of Antifa or the money behind. There are news reports, for example, that the day after Kenosha, there were rioters there from Portland, from other cities that had converged at that location. It appears that those are coordinated efforts, and it involves, I don't know how you'd put it any other way, but organized crime. Could you please comment and tell the American people how seriously the FBI takes those types of domestic terror activities, and the fact that there really is no distinction, or there is a distinction between the FBI's efforts in one area and the other?
So first, to be clear, the FBI has one standard for both, right, which is based on the law, based on the evidence available, based on our effort to protect the American people and uphold the Constitution. I can certainly understand, though, why people might formulate an impression, and part of that has to do with the fact that in a lot of the hundreds of investigations we've been conducting related to activity over the course of the summer, in some cases the most readily provable offense is a state or local charge rather than the availability of a ready-made federal charge. And to some extent, what you're seeing related to January 6th is that because a lot of the activity that was engaged in fairly straightforwardly implicates federal crimes, namely breaching federal property, going inside the Capitol, interfering with Congress, et cetera, it's easier to bring federal charges in that attack than it was over the summer. So a lot of those state and local prosecutions that you're referring to from over the summer have had our joint terrorism task forces
I don't mean to interrupt you.
working closely with our
Director
state
Wray,
and
I've
local
got 5
partners.
seconds
Yeah.
left, but I just want to mention there were attacks on federal facilities and cities across the United States.
Yes, and so that's the other piece of it, right? We have lots of investigations, lots of federal investigations. Like I mentioned, I think in my opening remarks, I think essentially all of our 56 field offices have been investigating activity there, and we are looking for things that are, of course, harder to drill into, but we're looking for things like funding, like logistics, like coordination. And so a lot of these gets down to questions of how readily available is the evidence, how clear is the federal jurisdiction. But when we have charges that we can bring federally, we're all in. We're all in. I mean, you know, some of these are offenses over the summer where people have brought, you know, thrown Molotov cocktails. In some cases, we were able to bring federal charges related to that. In some cases, there's an assault on a federal officer, and we're able to bring assault on federal officer charges. So we're looking for those types of offenses, but we're also looking at the kind of the more systematic type of issue. Again, funding, logistics, coordination, all that stuff. And a lot of this boils down to the less glamorous spade work that you would recognize from the investigative activity. Sometimes the evidence is readily available, sometimes it's harder to get at. But we're absolutely, we have one standard. I don't care whether you're upset at our criminal justice system or upset at our election system. Violence, assault on federal law enforcement, destruction of property is not the way to do it. That's our position.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Thank you, Director Wray, for your presence and your service to this country. The dramatic rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Asian violence throughout this country is unacceptable, unconscionable, and un-American. So let me begin, Director Wray, by just urging you and the FBI to dedicate all necessary resources to deal with and address this scourge. Director Wray, violent white supremacy is the most persistent and lethal threat to the American homeland, correct?
Well, the way we look at it, we've categorized it, I think we're saying the same thing, but just to be clear, we have elevated racially motivated violent extremism, the vast majority of which is motivated by advocacy on behalf of white superiority as at our highest threat priority level. That's commensurate with ISIS. And it is certainly true that over the last few years, the most lethal attacks here in the homeland have been by individuals of that racially motivated violent extremist category, specifically those advocating for the superiority of the white race.
Right, otherwise known as white supremacists. So the largest group, just to clarify, of racially motivated violent extremists are white supremacist organizations, is that right?
Well, I wouldn't say organizations, but individuals. The largest portion of domestic terrorist investigations that we have, and arrests or investigations of the racially motivated.
No, thank you. Let me ask you about organizations. The Oath Keepers are a white supremacist organization, true?
I'm not sure that I can characterize their ideology. I would say that we have charged a number of individuals related to specific terrorist activity or violent activity, maybe is a better way of putting it, who self-identify with the Oath Keepers. And I think some of those individuals are ones that we would put in this racially motivated violent extremist category. We also have a number of such investigations of individuals who self-identify with the Proud Boys in a similar vein. But again, in each of those instances, we're not charging them for their membership in Oath Keepers or Proud Boys. We're charging them based on their violent criminal activity.
Understood. The FBI respects the First Amendment, so do we in Congress, and we can agree on that. You anticipated my next question. The Oath Keepers clearly are a white supremacist organization. That's my observation, not yours, but happy to have you join me in that characterization. Would you say that the neo-Nazis are a white supremacist organization?
Well, I certainly, when I use the term neo-Nazis, I think of them as people who are advocating for white supremacy. That's at least the way I think of that term.
Okay. I'm wondering, why is the FBI generally reluctant to use the term violent white supremacy?
I think we use the term racially motivated violent extremism partly because we're trying to make clear to our people and everyone who's involved that our focus, that doesn't mean everybody else's focus, but our focus is on the violence. And so part of the reason we changed some of our nomenclature was to make especially sure that what's important to us, and it gets back to this idea that we have one standard. Doesn't matter what your motivation is or how abhorrent or despicable your motivation is, what we have to be focused on is the violence.
I understand that the violence is largely being driven by white supremacy as an ideology. If you don't name the problem and claim the problem, it seems to me that it's hard to tame the problem. That's why I'm raising this particular issue. In terms of domestic terrorism, I think you've testified in the past that this is a growing problem that we've experienced in America, correct?
Domestic terrorism? Absolutely.
That's correct.
Yes.
And I would argue that it is actually a problem that has been with us for centuries. We know that the KKK was founded in 1865. That's a terrorist organization. We know that the lynchings that took place in the 1800s and the 1900s were acts of domestic terror. The murder, the brutal killing of Emmett Till in 1955, that was an act of domestic terror. The bombings of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which took place in 1963, that was an act of domestic terror, killing 4 beautiful Black little girls. This most recent January 6th instance, the attack on the Capitol that resulted in death and mayhem, was an act of domestic terror. And the through line through all of those instances is white supremacy. I hope that the FBI will use all of its resources to tackle this persistent problem. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Ms. Sparks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Director Wray. I just wanted to follow up on some questions that my colleagues from California brought up related to the FISA opinion and the use of Section 702. Interestingly enough, I also had a letter with my colleague from Congressman Ted Lieu from California, so there is some common ground between California and Indiana on some issues. But and I appreciate that your assistant director sent in the response last night and on a few other letters. But one thing that he didn't respond, and we also requested a briefing, and I think my congresswoman from California did too. Would we be able to get a briefing by the end of this fiscal year?
Briefing on what we're doing to respond to the questions from the FISA opinion?
Yes, that, and also on your internal audit initiatives.
Sure, we were happy to provide a briefing, but certainly before
Thank you so much. Because as you know, this, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act 1978 was legislated by Congress to really address unlawful executive branch surveillance of U.S. citizens. And 2008 law created some loopholes, which given exemptions for surveillance of non-U.S. citizens on foreign soil. And as you know, it's been a decade. Application was very rough. In 2018, when Congress renewed this legislation, they explicitly required, documented all of the instances when it was violated. And as you know, the court also, the FISA also in a report in FISA court in the 2018 opinion found that the FBI procedure were in violation of the Fourth Amendment and due process, and you instill in all these new procedures and everything else. And in 2020 report, pretty much the court had still significant concerns with FBI implementations. Violations were more pervasive than previously believed, that FBI never applied to the FISC for an order, lack of written justification for bulk queries is particularly concerning, technical violation unaddressed for nearly a year, default rules architectures. There are a lot of different concerns, but in their opinion, court pretty much said we are concerned about the apparent widespread violation, but we don't have an evidence due to due to the pandemic, we couldn't do this really audits. So due to the absence of evidence to the contrary, court is willing to certify this process. Do you know, I used to be a Big Four auditor. If a PCIB would come to my engagement and they say, okay, you know what, you audited this engagement, there is no evidence, nothing is documented, but generally, since we didn't find, nothing was documented, no evidence provided, it's okay that you said that this is audit statements, is material respect, seems to be fair, and not materially misstated. I know that you mentioned that one of your internal audit partners is Big Four auditor, and I'm sure he would tell you I would be fired if PCOB would come to, to my audit and inspect my audit, because ultimately whatever not documented is not done. So do you believe that federal agency should be also held at the same standard as we hold private entities? It's not about the law. Do you believe it should hold it to the same standard?
Well, the whole, can you hear me? Yeah. The whole question about how auditing should be done is, of course, as you alluded to, a dense one. The internal auditor that we hired, the Big Four.
But I'm talking like external, because it's internal audit, and I have to disagree in your statement when you said to Congressman Issa, what is audit done for? Maybe your internal audits are done to find errors. Your external certification done by FISA court is actually to provide an opinion that in material respects you follow the law, not find an error. As an auditor, you don't want to find errors. That is not the goal for the auditor to find. So do you believe, since for 2021, since it's been already a decade, you and your internal controls director would be able to attest that you have all this detective preventative control, you've done all these different things, and now at this point you can actually say that you attest that and provide evidence that in material respect you follow the law, and if you don't follow, what in the error rate you accepting to be able to say, I violated Fourth Amendment right for how many citizens it's acceptable to violate it? Would you be able to attest it for your 2021 with all of the new procedures and provide for FISA court when they do new report, this evidence?
So maybe it'd be better for me to be able to explain a little bit more about our audit program, and it could be that some of this can be better addressed through the briefing we're talking about standing up for you. But to be clear, the individual we brought in is here to stand up an Office of Internal Audit and to be able to do.
But as an executive in the office, you are responsible for the office. As the CEO of the company, you're responsible for the office. You're responsible to follow the law as it's written. So would you be able to provide this time and evidence that we don't go another decade, because you have authorization in a few years, provide this evidence and say, yes, we can provide evidence, we don't violate the rights of U.S. citizens?
The gentlelady's time has expired, but you can answer the question.
I think it would be best, this is a complicated topic, there's a lot that I have to say on it, but it'd be probably better addressed through the briefing that...
Okay, I'll look forward to it. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Director Wray, for your service to our country, and thank you to the men and women of the FBI. Gun violence is an epidemic in our country. In my home state of Rhode Island last month, a 31-year-old man was shot at a park while playing with his son. A teenage woman was killed while sitting in a car. A 20-year-old man was shot to death outside of his home. And the same thing is happening in cities all across America. And there's no question that this problem has gotten worse during the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, Rhode Island saw a significant increase in gun sales, and during that same time, we saw an 87% increase in gun-related deaths. And that trend has continued into 2021. And so I hope that you can shed some light on what the FBI can do and how Congress can support the agency to fight an epidemic that will claim 40,000 American lives this year. And so specifically, as I discussed, gun rails skyrocketed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Nearly 23 million firearms were purchased nationwide in 2020, a 64% increase. And for each of these sales, a background check is required, putting tremendous pressure on our background check system. And in fact, in March of last year, the start of the pandemic, federal background checks hit a 1 million in a week mark. And so what does that increase in gun sales mean for the background check system and for public safety, and particularly with respect to your ability to complete a background check within 3 days as required by the statute?
So, Congressman, I appreciate the question for a number of reasons, not the least of which is our folks at NICS, the background check systems, have worked incredibly hard this past year in particular, right through the teeth of the pandemic, and had to be very creative in terms of how we kept people socially distanced, rotating shifts, et cetera. We lived in fear that we would suddenly lose the ability to be able to continue to process the checks because we could potentially wipe out, in terms of having to quarantine, an entire room full of cubicles of people. We processed last year 40...
Yeah, my question, I guess, is would additional resources be helpful in order to keep up with this pace so that we don't have the 3-day period passing before the background check can be completed?
Absolutely. We have been having to do overtime. We've been having to pull people from other key missions to staff it. I am very proud of the fact that even though we did a record, you used 23 million, my information is that we processed 40 million firearms background checks last year, and then we were able to complete about 96% of those within the 3 days, despite that record, despite the pandemic.
Thank you, Director. So in 2018, the Center for American Progress, and according to FBI data as well, almost 4,000 prohibited purchasers were able to get a gun because the background check for their sale was not completed within 3 days. This is the loophole that allowed the Charleston shooter, who legally should have never been allowed to purchase a firearm, to buy a gun and use it to murder 9 worshipers in a church. So my question is, how is the FBI supporting the ATF's recovery of firearms found to be transferred to a prohibited purchaser? Are you giving specific instructions nationwide to ATF offices on how to do this? Are those practices being formalized? Because my experience is they're supposed to be recovered by ATF, but it doesn't seem like that happens. This is individuals who got a gun from a gun store who were legally prohibited from owning it. And I've actually introduced a bill, the Unlawful Gun Buyer Alert, that would require local law enforcement be notified if firearms are delivered to a prohibited purchaser, and wonder whether you think that would also be helpful in making jurisdictions aware when someone has illegally purchased a gun. But I'm really interested to know what you're doing with your field offices with ATF in this recovery, and how we can at least take on this issue of people getting guns from a gun store who don't pass a background check.
I think it might be better for me to offer to have my staff provide you more information about the details of how we work with ATF. They have a very, very tough job, as you alluded to, in recovering the guns that are sold to people who are prohibited by law from having them.
Maybe a briefing on that, Director, because that'd be very helpful.
We'd be happy to set up a briefing on that subject.
And my last question, Director, is since September 11th, the FBI has provided tens of millions of dollars of counterterrorism training and resources to state and local law enforcement agencies. How is the FBI reallocating this support to state and local partners to address the rise of white supremacist and anti-government groups? And is the Bureau also giving guidance to the Joint Terrorism Task Force to address white supremacist extremism?
So a couple things there. One is we absolutely are providing domestic terrorism training to state and local partners, and we've actually recently been providing some of our more advanced training to the state and local officers, of whom there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds who are task force officers on our joint terrorism task forces. As to the prioritization of the joint terrorism task forces on domestic terrorism and specifically racially motivated violent extremism, when I elevated that to our highest priority level back in summer of 2019, the effect of that was to make sure that not only that all 56 field officers are collecting intelligence and disseminating it on that subject, but also to make sure that all 200 plus joint terrorism task forces and the 4,500 or 5,000, whatever it is, investigators that are on them have domestic terrorism, and specifically that part of domestic terrorism, squarely within their sights.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, why did you take their copy of the Constitution?
I'm sorry, take copy of whose
the couple in Alaska that turned out to be the wrong couple. You kicked in their door, you held them at gunpoint, handcuffed them, interrogated them for 4 hours. You took their phone, you took their laptop, and you took a copy of their pocket-sized Constitution. Why'd you take the Constitution?
Well, Congressman, as you know, I can't discuss a specific investigation. I'm not sure whether your characterization is accurate or not, but I can't provide specific information about a pending investigation.
It's been reported in the press. Our staff has actually talked to these individuals. That's what, I mean, they tells us exactly what happened. I'm just curious, you know, I see what you had the wrong couple, but if you take their phone, their laptop, I'm just curious why you take their Constitution.
Again, I can't comment on a specific investigation and what the
Have you personally talked to the Hoopers?
Have I talked to whom?
Have you talked to this couple in Alaska? Again, the couple who had their door kicked in, damage to their door. The FBI has now repaired their door, held at gunpoint, handcuffed, and interrogated for 4 hours. Have you talked to him personally?
No, I have not.
If you find out it's really, I mean, I think it's obvious based on what we've discovered that this was the wrong couple, that these weren't people who did anything wrong. If you find out they are, will you call them?
I'd have to look at the circumstances of what happened, but it's an ongoing investigation. That's all I can really say on it at this time.
If it turns out you've sent their phone back to them, their laptop back to them, if it turns out that they are the wrong couple, as I think that is pretty obvious, what happens to the data on the phone that you have?
I'm sorry, can you explain a little bit more what you're asking?
You keep a record, like you returned the phone to them, but the data on the phone, do you have like copies of their text messages, emails, anything on their phone? Did you keep all that?
Well, when we return people's information, my impression is that we don't keep that information, but it depends on the circumstances of the investigation.
It's an innocent couple. Your impression is you're not going to keep information?
Well, again, I can't discuss a specific investigation. If you would like to get more information about how it works when we return, more generally, our policies and practices when we return information, I'm happy to see if we can provide that information to you separately.
Well, you would think if they're innocent, if they're not guilty, and you've got information on them, you would get rid of that information. The FBI wouldn't keep it.
And I'm not trying to.
But again, in light of what we've found out about FISA, maybe not.
I'm really not trying to quibble with you here. The only reason I'm providing what sounds like a confusing answer is because each case is different, depends on the circumstances as to how you got the information, what the circumstances were. We certainly have instances where we purge information that we have. I know that happens. We have other instances where we may be investigating something and the information is kept. But again, it depends on the circumstances as a whole.
Do you know how this couple was identified? I mean, you look on your Twitter site, the posted tweet is a crowdsourcing. Can you help us find these individuals? You got pictures of individuals. This is relative to January 6th. Was this couple in Alaska found through the crowdsourcing, that technique?
I don't know the answer to that sitting here right now. And again, I want to be careful not to discuss a specific investigation. I will say that more generally, related to January 6th, part of the purpose of putting out information for the public is for the public to identify, people who know people to identify.
Are you doing that as well for the rioters, the people in the Antifa in Portland? You're doing that as well? Them?
Yes, okay, absolutely.
Is it a habit of the FBI to take constitutions from people that you're interrogating?
I don't know if it's a habit to pursue any particular document. We just seize the evidence that's relevant to what's in the affidavit, search warrant affidavit that we presented to the judge who signed off on it.
Did you sign off on the raid on Mayor Giuliani's apartment?
Again, I'm not going to discuss any specific investigation. I don't normally sign off on specific operational activity as FBI director.
That's not what I asked. I asked, did you sign off on this specific FBI activity where the president's personal lawyer's apartment in Manhattan was raided?
And again, I'm not going to discuss any specific investigation.
Are you aware of any leaks by the FBI or the Department of Justice about an investigation of Postmaster General DeJoy?
I'm aware of news coverage about an investigation related to that individual, but I'm not aware of leaks from people inside the FBI.
You haven't been briefed on anything relative to the FBI or the Justice Department relating to that leak of an investigation of the Postmaster?
Gentleman's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
I can't discuss a specific investigation. I am aware of the news coverage about the investigation you're referring to, and I'm just going to have to leave it at that here.
Thank you, Director.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Director, the plain definition of an insurrection is violent uprising against government. On January 6th, an officer died. A couple days later, 2 died, death by suicide. Hundreds were injured that day. An eye was lost, fingers were lost. Officers suffered a heart attack. The counting of the Electoral College was suspended for approximately 6 hours. Members of Congress retreated to a secure location. Was January 6th an insurrection?
Well, Congressman, I certainly understand why you would describe it that way. In my role as FBI director, because that's a term that has legal meaning, I really have to be careful about using words like that, not getting ahead of both prosecutors and judges who have very strong opinions on what kind of public commentary, as you may remember from your past life, I can engage in. So I certainly understand why you're asking the question, given the circumstances both you described and a lot of the other details surrounding the attack. We are treating it as an act of domestic terrorism and investigating it through our Joint Terrorism Task Force. We are, as you know, now in the midst of bringing any number of conspiracy charges, which are particularly serious. But this is a very ongoing investigation, and there's a lot more to come, and I would expect to see more charges, and some of them may be more serious charges.
Director, we're all grateful when we saw the FBI's SWAT team and its forensics team on the floor after the attack. But before the attack, you told the Intel Committee that you were looking for and through social media as a key part of investigations, and that you would get tips from social media companies. Prior to January 6th, did the FBI receive any tips from social media companies about threats to the Capitol?
Well, we've had so much information now, I'm reluctant to sort of answer any question about the word any, especially because we're now, 500 arrests into an investigation and after the fact. Certainly we were aware of online chatter about the potential for violence, but I'm not aware that we had any intelligence indicating that hundreds of individuals were going to storm the Capitol itself, to my knowledge.
Do you believe the Bureau has the ability to monitor publicly available social media or open source intelligence collection?
Can you just repeat the question? I want to be sure I answer it.
Yeah, do you have the authority and ability to monitor open source intelligence collection? So, for example, any website, chat room, where consistently groups there are posting about threats, whether it's to the Capitol, whether it's to law enforcement. Do you have the ability and can you monitor open source?
So the answer to that, unfortunately, like so many things, is complicated. There are Attorney General guidelines as implemented through the so-called DIOG that have been around for many, many years now that govern what we can and cannot do in the space, all of which are geared towards protecting the First Amendment. With proper predication and an authorized purpose, there are a lot of things we can do on social media. But what we're not allowed to do is just sit and monitor social media and look at one person's posts, just looking to see if maybe something would happen just in case. That we're not allowed to do.
Well, in the public realm, we are learning that this attack on the Capitol was not a 500-year storm. In fact, as we speak right now, there's a count going on in Arizona related to the 2020 election where claims are being made that the outcome was fraudulent. The former president is telling people that he plans to be reinstated in August. And so you can see that when you have those statements, that count, social media may be a place to look as far as intentions to try and reinstate the president. Knowing that a storm may be coming, Director, what can we do to make sure that an attack like that does not happen again?
So what we can do, and we benefit very much from, is getting tips and leads about things that are on social media, from everything from social media companies themselves to members of the public. You often hear the expression that DHS coined of if you see something, say something. And most people imagine when they hear that, the unattended backpack in a Greyhound bus terminal or something. And obviously we want people to say something then too. Well, what we're trying to communicate is if you see something that looks like criminal activity and threat of violence, say something, including if you see something on social media, we need you to say something. And that's what our tip center is partly there for. but you can contact law enforcement, state and local law enforcement.
And has
Make sure
your
somebody
judgment,
gets the
The
information.
committee's,
Thank you, Director. Has your judgment changed that there was not widespread fraud in the 2020 election?
As former Attorney General Barr and former Acting Attorney General Rosen have both said, we looked, but we didn't see evidence of fraud sufficient to change the outcome of the presidential election.
Thank you, Director.
Gentlemen's time has expired. At this time, the committee will stand in recess for about half an hour. We will resume promptly at 1 p.m.